Early life and family. Richard Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas, to Mexican immigrant parents, Julian and Mercedes Ramirez. From the very beginning, Richard's life was marred by violence and dysfunction. His father, a harsh and abusive man, worked as a laborer and had a volatile temper. He was often drunk, which made him a terrifying figure in the Ramirez household. Richard's mother, Mercedes, was a deeply religious woman, but her constant attempts to shield her children from their father's wrath were often ineffective. Growing up in a neighborhood full of poverty and crime, Richard faced a brutal childhood. He was the youngest of 5 children, and his early years were marked by constant physical abuse from his father. But it was not just the physical violence that scarred Richard. The family often lived in fear, and the tension in their home was palpable. His father's anger would often spill over into violent outbursts, and Richard learned from a young age that fear and violence were normal parts of life. Richard's formative years were further shaped by an incident that would haunt him for the rest of his life. At the age of 12, Richard was introduced to a man who would later become a significant influence on him, his older cousin, Mike. Mike was a Vietnam War veteran, and during their time together, he showed Richard a disturbing side of life. He would often boast about the atrocities he committed during the war, and one day, he even took Richard to a secret location where he showed him the body of a woman he had brutally murdered. The horror of witnessing this crime had a lasting effect on Richard, fueling his fascination with death, violence, and the macabre. Soon after this incident, Richard began to spiral. His behavior became increasingly erratic. At school, he was a quiet, withdrawn child, struggling to fit in with his peers. His sense of isolation grew, and the seeds of violence that would later define his adult life were planted. He started skipping school, spending more time in the streets, and experimenting with drugs like marijuana and LSD. These substances allowed him to escape from his painful reality, but they also deepened his detachment from the world around him. Despite the chaos in his life, Richard was never fully able to break free from the influence of his family. His relationship with his father remained strained, and he often sought refuge in his mother's strict Catholic faith. But even religion could not shield him from the darkness creeping into his soul. His early experiences with violence, both at home and in the streets, laid the groundwork for the monstrous acts he would later commit. The pain, neglect, and horrors of his early life fused together, creating a perfect storm of rage and resentment that would soon explode. The transformation begins. As Richard Ramirez entered his teenage years, the seeds of violence that had been planted in his childhood began to take root and grow. By the age of 13, he was already on a path that would lead him into a life of crime and brutality. The trauma he had experienced at home, coupled with the influence of his troubled cousin, Mike, began to consume him. Richard's behavior became increasingly erratic, and he started engaging in petty theft and minor crimes. The rush he got from breaking the law and escaping from his broken reality grew stronger with each passing day. During his adolescence, Richard was exposed to the darker sides of life. He was often seen hanging around the wrong crowds, where he became acquainted with drugs, violence, and criminal activity. By the age of 14, he had already begun experimenting with marijuana and LSD, seeking to numb the pain and confusion that consumed him. These substances not only provided temporary relief, but also fed his growing sense of detachment from society. In the drug-fueled haze, Richard found an escape, and over time, his mental state became more erratic and unpredictable. However, it wasn't just drugs that influenced Richard's descent. His fascination with violence and death grew stronger as he spent more time with Mike. Richard began to admire the violent acts his cousin had committed during the Vietnam War. Mike would often tell Richard chilling stories about the horrors of the war, boasting about the murders he had carried out without remorse. It was during these moments that Richard's psyche began to shift, as he began to see violence as a means of asserting power and control over others. At the age of 15, Richard's life took an even darker turn. His first serious criminal act was a burglary that escalated into a violent encounter. The adrenaline of breaking into homes and taking what wasn't his became an obsession. It wasn't just the thrill of stealing that excited him. It was the power he felt when invading someone's space, violating their personal world. His crimes became more brazen and violent, and he developed a thirst for chaos. During this time, Richard's obsession with Satanism also began to take hold. He was deeply influenced by the media, particularly stories about serial killers and the occult. Richard was captivated by the idea of Satanism and began to see himself as a servant of the devil. He began wearing pentagrams and openly embracing dark symbolism, even referring to himself as the devil's son. This growing obsession with Satanism was more than just a phase. It became central to his identity and a driving force in his mind as he descended further into madness. He saw Satanism as a way to justify his violent impulses, believing that the devil would empower him to commit unspeakable acts without facing consequences. By the age of 16, Richard had fully embraced his transformation into someone unrecognizable to his former self. No longer the shy, withdrawn child he once was, he now radiated an air of dangerous unpredictability. His behavior grew more erratic and disturbing, and he increasingly saw the world around him as a playground for his darker impulses. Richard's family, particularly his mother, began to notice a dramatic change in his demeanor. He became distant and menacing, an angry young man full of rage and resentment toward everyone who had wronged him. It was at this point that Richard's dark side began to emerge in full force. The combination of his troubled upbringing, exposure to violence, and fascination with death, crime, and Satanism set the stage for the horrors that would follow. As he entered adulthood, Richard's path would only become more twisted, and the transformation from a troubled teenager to a cold-blooded killer was now well underway. Richard Ramirez committed his first known murder on June 28, 1984. His victim was a 79-year-old woman named Jenny Vinco. She lived alone in her apartment in Los Angeles. That night, Richard broke in through a window. He had no plan, just a deep, uncontrollable urge to kill. Inside, he found Jenny asleep. He attacked her with a knife, stabbing her repeatedly. After she was dead, he mutilated her body. This was more than just a robbery. It was the beginning of something much darker. After leaving the crime scene, Richard felt powerful. He had taken a life, and it excited him. But he didn't stop. In March 1985, he struck again. This time, he attacked Maria Hernandez, a young woman in her 20s. He followed her to her home in Rosemead, California. As she reached her front door, Richard pulled out a gun and shot at her. By chance, the bullet hit her keys, saving her life. She fell to the ground and played dead. Richard then entered her home and shot her roommate, Dale Okazaki, killing her instantly. That same night, he found another victim. He pulled 30-year-old Tsai-Lian Yu out of her car and shot her. She died before she reached the hospital. News of the brutal attacks spread quickly. The media gave him a name, the Night Stalker. Richard's killing spree had begun. Over the next few months, he targeted more people breaking into homes at night, using different weapons, knives, guns, hammers. His victims were men, women, even elderly couples. He didn't follow a pattern, which made him even more dangerous. The police were struggling to catch him. Terror in Los Angeles. By mid-1985, Richard Ramirez had transformed into a relentless predator. He struck without warning, targeting men, women, and even the elderly. His victims ranged from young professionals to retired couples, and no one felt safe in their own home. What made Richard truly terrifying was his unpredictability. Unlike other serial killers who had specific types of victims or patterns, Richard attacked at random. Some nights, he would use a gun, shooting his victims in their beds. Other times, he would bring knives, hammers, or even tire irons to beat his victims to death. He left satanic symbols at crime scenes and often told survivors to swear to Satan. The people of Los Angeles were paralyzed with fear. News channels warned citizens to lock their doors and windows at night. Stores ran out of locks, guns, and guard dogs. People stopped feeling safe in their own homes. It didn't matter where they lived. Rich neighborhoods, poor communities, apartments, or houses, Richard always found a way in. One of his most horrifying attacks occurred on July 20th, 1985. That night, he broke into the home of 66-year-old Layla Needing and her 68-year-old husband, Max Needing. He shot Max first, then brutally assaulted Layla before killing her too. The scene was horrifying, and the police were left with no real leads. Just 2 days later, Richard struck again. He broke into the home of 75-year-old Joyce Nelson. He beat her to death with his fists and left a shoe print on her face. That same night, he broke into another home, shooting a man and raping his wife. The police connected the shoe prints at both crime scenes. By now, the media was calling him the Night Stalker. The entire city was living in fear, and police were under intense pressure to catch him. But Richard wasn't done yet. His bloodlust was growing stronger, and he was beginning to think he was untouchable. The mistake that exposed him. For months, Richard Ramirez seemed like a ghost, striking in the dark, leaving behind horror, and vanishing without a trace. The police had no solid leads, and the people of Los Angeles lived in constant fear. But no killer is perfect. Eventually, Richard made a mistake. On July 20th, 1985, after brutally murdering Layla and Max Needing, Richard broke into another home that same night. His victims, 63-year-old Chitat Asawahem and his wife Sakima, suffered a horrific attack. Richard shot Chitat in the head, killing him instantly, and then assaulted Sakima before forcing her to swear her allegiance to Satan. Before leaving, Richard stepped in a patch of blood. His black Avia sneakers left a clear print on the floor. It was a rare type of sneaker, and police realized that the same shoe print had been found at multiple crime scenes. This was the first major clue linking the murders together. Over the next few weeks, Richard continued his spree, moving beyond Los Angeles. On August 6th, he traveled to Northridge, where he shot Christopher Peterson and his wife, Virginia, in their sleep. Miraculously, both survived and provided descriptions of their attacker. Just a few days later, on August 8th, Richard struck again in Diamond Bar, California. He murdered an elderly couple, leaving more shoe prints behind. The police now had a connection between multiple crime scenes. They knew they were hunting one man. Then came the biggest breakthrough. On August 24th, Richard stole an orange Toyota in Los Angeles. He drove to San Francisco and committed another murder. This time, he left behind something crucial: his fingerprints. The police found the car abandoned a few days later and dusted it for prints. This time, they got a match. The prints belonged to Richard Ramirez, a criminal already in the system. The Night Stalker finally had a name. His face was about to be everywhere. The chase begins. Richard Ramirez had no idea the police were closing in on him. For months, he had terrorized California, breaking into homes, attacking men, women, and even children. He believed he was untouchable. But everything was about to change. After matching his fingerprints to the stolen Toyota, the police finally had a name: Richard Ramirez. His criminal record showed past arrests for theft, drug possession, and carjackings, but now he was wanted for murder. On August 29, 1985, the Los Angeles Police Department held a press conference. They revealed Richard's name and his mugshot to the public. His face was on every newspaper, every television screen, and every news report. The man who had lurked in the shadows was now exposed for the world to see. Richard, unaware of this, had taken a bus to Arizona in search of his brother. When he couldn't find him, he returned to Los Angeles on August 31st. As he stepped off the Greyhound bus that morning, he noticed something strange. People were staring at him. Whispers spread through the crowd. A woman pointed at him and gasped, "El Matador!" Spanish for the killer. Richard glanced at a nearby newspaper stand and saw his own face staring back at him. The headline read, "Night Stalker Identified." Panic set in. He ran. Richard sprinted through the streets, trying to steal a car, but the driver fought back. He ran through neighborhoods, looking for a way out, but people recognized him everywhere. In a desperate attempt to escape, he tried to carjack another vehicle. This time, the owner and his neighbors fought back. A group of citizens chased Richard down, hitting him with pipes and restraining him until the police arrived. When officers finally took him into custody, Richard looked up and muttered, "Thank God." The reign of the Night Stalker was over. The trial of the Night Stalker. Richard Ramirez's arrest brought relief to California, but the fight for justice was just beginning. His trial would become one of the most infamous in American history, lasting over 4 years and costing nearly $1.8 million, one of the most expensive trials of its time. From the moment Richard stepped into the courtroom, his behavior shocked the public. He showed no remorse for his crimes. Instead, he smiled, laughed, and often made disturbing comments. On the first day of his trial, he lifted his hand to reveal a pentagram drawn on his palm and said, "Hail, Satan." His presence unsettled everyone. Dressed in dark clothing, his long black hair falling over his face, Richard looked every bit like the monster people feared. Some reporters even described him as having a hypnotic, almost otherworldly aura. The trial process was painfully slow. The legal system struggled to handle the sheer number of charges against him: 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, and 14 counts of burglary. The prosecution had mountains of evidence, including fingerprints, shoe prints, and survivor testimonies. But Richard's defense team tried to delay the process. At one point, his lawyers requested a change of venue, arguing that the media coverage had made a fair trial impossible. The judge denied the request, and the trial continued. Strangely, despite his horrific crimes, Richard developed a group of devoted female admirers. Some women wrote him love letters, believing he was misunderstood or even falsely accused. One woman, Doreen Leoy, was so obsessed with him that she later married him while he was on death row. In 1988, before the trial was even over, the courtroom was shaken by a disturbing discovery. Jail officers found a plan Richard had written to escape by killing a deputy and taking his gun. Because of this, security around him was tightened, with officers constantly monitoring his movements. After years of legal battles, on September 20th, 1989, the jury found Richard Ramirez guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to death, telling him, "You have no hope for mercy." But Richard remained unfazed. As he was led out of the courtroom, he looked at reporters and said, "So, big deal. Death always comes with the territory. I'll see you in Disneyland." Justice had been served, but the nightmare of the Night Stalker would never be forgotten. The death sentence. After Richard Ramirez was sentenced to death in 1989, he was sent to San Quentin State Prison, one of the most notorious prisons in California. He was placed on death row, where he would spend the rest of his life waiting for execution. For most criminals, a death sentence brings fear or regret. But Richard showed neither. He laughed, smirked, and seemed to embrace his fate. When asked about his feelings on death, he responded coldly, "Death always comes with the territory. See you in Disneyland." Even behind bars, Richard remained a disturbing figure. He never apologized for his crimes. Instead, he spent his days reading about Satanism, drawing disturbing artwork, and writing letters to his fans. Surprisingly, Richard attracted a large following of admirers, mostly women who found him fascinating. They sent him love letters, photographs, and even proposals. One woman, Doreen Leoy, became so obsessed with him that she visited him regularly. She truly believed he was innocent and, in 1996, she married him in prison. She once told the media, "He's kind, he's funny, he's charming." The families of his victims were outraged. How could a serial killer receive love and attention while their loved ones were gone forever? Despite being sentenced to death, Richard's execution kept getting delayed. The U.S. justice system allows death row inmates to appeal their sentences, and Richard's lawyers took advantage of this. Years passed, and he remained in prison, waiting for a date that never seemed to come. He lived much longer than any of his victims had a chance to. But in the end, death still came for Richard Ramirez, just not in the way he expected. The end of the Night Stalker. For over 2 decades, Richard Ramirez sat on death row at San Quentin State Prison. His execution date was constantly delayed due to the slow legal process, multiple appeals, and California's complicated death penalty system. Though he had been sentenced to death in 1989, many believed he would never actually be executed. Despite being one of the most infamous serial killers in American history, Richard adapted to prison life. He was kept in a high-security cell, away from other inmates for his own safety. Some prisoners wanted to harm him, knowing the horrors he had committed. Others saw him as a dark legend. Richard continued to receive fan mail from admirers, mostly women who believed he was misunderstood or even falsely accused. His most famous admirer, Doreen Leoy, had married him in 1996. She claimed she would wait for him forever, even if he was executed. However, as the years passed, their relationship faded, and she eventually stopped visiting. While he was behind bars, true crime books, documentaries, and interviews kept his name in the public eye. Some journalists tried to interview him, hoping to understand his mind, but Richard remained elusive, often speaking in riddles or vague philosophical statements. Despite his belief that he would die by execution, Richard's life ended in an unexpected way. On June 7, 2013, at the age of 53, he died at Marin General Hospital from complications related to B-cell lymphoma, a form of cancer. For a man who embraced death and claimed to worship Satan, Richard's end was almost anticlimactic. He didn't die in the electric chair or by lethal injection. Instead, he wasted away in a hospital bed, weak and powerless. Richard Ramirez, once the most feared man in California, was gone. But his dark legacy remained, haunting those who had survived him and those who still feared the evil he represented. The legacy of evil. Even after his death, Richard Ramirez's name remains infamous, a chilling reminder of the terror he unleashed. His brutal crimes left a lasting impact on California and the world, changing how people viewed safety in their own homes. During his reign of terror in 1984 and 1985, Ramirez did something few killers had done before. He attacked randomly, with no pattern, no specific type of victim. This made him even more terrifying. No one felt safe. Wealthy or poor, young or old, living in a house or an apartment, it didn't matter. His break-ins forced people to change their habits. By the time he was caught, Los Angeles had become a city of locked doors and bolted windows. Sales of security systems, guard dogs, and firearms skyrocketed. People double-checked their doors at night, afraid of the dark in ways they never had been before. Over the years, the story of the Night Stalker has been retold in books, documentaries, podcasts, and TV shows. Some films and series were inspired by his crimes, showing how deeply his evil acts impacted society. True crime enthusiasts continue to study him, trying to understand what made him a monster. Was it his childhood abuse, his obsession with Satanism, his drug use, or was he simply born evil? Unlike some serial killers who eventually express regret, Ramirez never apologized. He showed no remorse, no sympathy for his victims. In one of his final interviews, he smirked and said, "I am beyond good and evil." Even in death, he remained defiant. He never faced execution, escaping the fate his victims never had a chance to avoid. Richard Ramirez may be gone, but his dark legacy lives on. He remains one of the most feared and studied serial killers in history. His crimes changed law enforcement tactics, led to stronger home security awareness, and left a permanent scar on those who survived him. For his victims and their families, the pain he caused will never fade. But at least one thing is certain: the Night Stalker will never hunt again.